So there are a few types of joineries that you can use when you're building a cabinet or a drawer or whatever piece that you're working on. The one type of joinery that I typically like to use is the Dado. I think it's a very easy joinery to make and requires pretty much basic tools. If you have like a router, you could definitely make it for your project as well. Not only does it provide a little bit more strength, it also helps with aligning panels together. Think of like a bookcase with all of the shelves and also cabinetry with the dividers. So it's a great joint for practically any project you're working on. So in this video, I'm going to go over 3 different ways for us to make that joint. So you could probably pick up one of these methods depending on the tools that you have in your shop. There are definitely pros and cons between these methods, and I'll go over them in detail a little bit later. So the first method that I like to use when I first started doing woodworking is just to use a trim router. These are very inexpensive. You could probably pick one up used for like 50 bucks or something like that. It's all about getting the right bit for this to work. So what I have here is a top bearing bit. This bearing will allow us to guide the router along a straight edge or some type of straight guide. That's how we're going to make our dados. And there are other accessories that you can use to make this cut. One is putting a bushing at the bottom. But with the bushings, it really depends on your router and whether or not the router can accept the bushing or not. And also, usually routers come with edge guides. With the edge guides, you're limited to how far the edge guides will extend. So let's go over the first method on making these dados. So for this first method, again, we're using the trim router here. And the key to this is having edge guides that are perfectly straight on one edge. That's because you're referencing your cut off of this edge. If there's any way to it, your router will follow that curve and you're not going to get a perfect joint. For the first method, you want to first establish a straight line for the first guide. I like to use a 24-inch T-square since that's long enough for most of the projects that I work on. Once the line is marked, I can then align the first guide and clamp it down. Then I'll take a piece that will fit inside the dado and use it to mark a second line for the other fence to align to. You could always simply butt the second guide against your vertical piece, and if you're using the jig that I made, it's pretty much how you would do it. However, just make sure that there isn't any debris between the vertical piece and the second guide, or else the joint will be too loose. Because I'm using a trim router, I'll clean out the depth and the width of the dado in 2 passes. In the second method, I'll talk more about undersized plywood router bits that you can buy that will make cutting all these dados really quick and easy. But I think most of us would have a generic set of router bits somewhere in the shop. And that's what I call perfect. As I mentioned before, you can butt up the second rail against your vertical piece. Just make sure that there's no dust or debris in between the vertical piece and the rail so you can get a nice tight fit. Just like that, we have a very clean joint with a very inexpensive tool. I made a jig for this a while back with free plans that you can go ahead and check out up here in this link. It's pretty much the same setup. I added a little bit more bells and whistles to that jig. There's some knobs in there that you can kind of use to tighten up your guide rails. Check out the video with the free plans if you want to build something like this for your shop. And the great thing about this setup is it doesn't really matter how long your board is. You're taking the tool to your workpiece, so pretty much you can have a 12-foot long shelf that you're trying to build. So all you gotta do is move your guides wherever you need, make your measurements and marking, and pretty much you're really set. The downside of this is your joints really depend heavily on how accurate you set up your guides. So if your guides aren't set up right, you might have a dado that's too tight or too loose. And also it might not even be squared. And also you're trying to mirror these dados onto another board, like let's say you're doing the left and the right panel of a bookshelf. You want to make sure that those dados are in the exact same location. Going with this method, you could probably lay out one board here and another board in the back set your guide all the way across both boards and make the cut. But again, the level of accuracy really depends on how well you set up your guides for this method. And that brings us to method number 2, which will be using the router table. This is SawStop's router table. I got the inline version, which installs directly into my cabinet table saw here. So full disclosure, SawStop does not sponsor the channel. However, they did send over this router table as well as another tool that we'll talk about later on. So I just want to give a huge shout out to SawStop for sending these tools over for me to do this demonstration for you guys. I do get to keep all of it, but I wanted to let you guys know how they're involved in this. But with SawStop, you know you're getting a very high quality product, so nothing bad to say there. If you never used a router table before, it's essentially just a table with a router built inside of it. There are some mechanisms here that allow you to lower and lift up the router as needed based off of the depth that you need to make your cuts. Then there's also a locking mechanism right here to lock the router in place so it doesn't move on you. With the router table, it comes with a fence where you can reference your piece off of to make your cuts. Because you're referencing off of this fence, which is absolutely flat and straight, your cuts are going to be perfectly parallel with this fence too. Also, you have way better dust collection here. In this case, the fence does have its own dust collection port here. And also I have the dust collection box because as you guys saw earlier with the trim router, it does create a lot of dust if you don't have a shroud to collect it. So this is going to definitely be way better in terms of dust collection. For router table setups, I like to use bits like these. This is a set of bits made for plywood. And that's because when we buy plywood, even though it says 3/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch, it's not really 3/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch. It's slightly thinner than that. So these bits are made perfectly for that. They're slightly undersized to match the thickness of the plywood. So you're working with a lot of plywood, I definitely recommend a bit set like this. You don't really need it. You can always do multiple passes like you would with a trim router, but these do help with the accuracy. The great thing with the router table is this dial right here. It allows you to adjust the depth of your cut up to 2/1000ths of an inch, so you can get really accurate with this type of setup here. So we're going to install our router bit. In this case, I'm using the 23/32 bit here because we're using 3/4 inch plywood panels. So let's get to it. For the router table, I prefer to use 1/2 inch shank bits. It's much stronger and more stable compared to the 1/4 inch shank versions. However, they're generally more expensive. I like to have 1/2 inch shank bits for things like flush trimming, joinery, and patterning, which I don't often perform on a trim router. I would then have a 1/4 inch bit set for my trim router dedicated to edge profiles like roundovers or chamfers. Consider how you work in your shop so you're not having to spend so much money on a bunch of router bits that you may not need or doesn't really fit your workflow. Now, I know I mentioned earlier that the router table is way better at dust collection. Yes, it's true, but routers in general just makes a ton of dust. So you're going to get some dust on the table and around your work area no matter what. But having a dust box and a fence that has a dust port really helps. When I'm not using the dust port on my fence, I'll close it to help direct all the suction down into the box below. As you can see, having a bigger size router with an undersized plywood bit makes this cut super quick and easy. As you can tell, that was really easy to set up. All you had to do is install your bit, set your height. That's pretty much it. So there is that benefit of setup time, and you know that it's going to be accurate because you're referencing off of a very straight fence here. And also, if I wanted to create a mirror dado on the other side, then all I had to do is simply flip this over and then reference my piece off of this edge, and that will give me a dado that's the same distance on both sides. If you have a dedicated router table that's separate from your table saw, then you're limited to how far back your fence will go. In this case, if I push my fence all the way back, this is the most I can push back to create a dado. Say if I need to turn this piece this way, that's all I can cut. Like, that's the limit to it. I can cut anywhere from here at the edge of the workpiece all the way up to that fence there, and that's really about it. So that is one of the limitations of using a router table. However, the cool thing about the inline router table is I can take off this fence and actually use my table saw fence as a guide. So I'm going to show you exactly how that's done. For these cuts, I'm measuring the distance using a measuring tape since the ruler on the table saw is referenced for the table saw blade. To make the second cut, I'll just push the fence over a little bit, and that's pretty much it. I know that this piece isn't really that long, but I think it demonstrates the possibilities fairly well. You can imagine if you're working on a bookshelf with many shelving units, how useful this could be. This is probably my favorite feature about having an inline router table set up for the shop. I went ahead and made 2 side panels to show how accurate you can get the dado placement with very minimal effort. And it's perfectly square every single time. So there you guys have it. I got the 2 side panels here with the dados cut out on the router table. And then I just installed these 2 plywood, 3/4 inch plywood sheets here. This could be a cubby for a tool or something, just put on the top and the bottom. But I just wanted to show you guys how precise it is. Like, that's the benefit of using a router table and having a fence that you can use as a reference to create the dados, especially when you're trying to mirror things on both sides. And as you guys saw earlier, I was able to use my table saw fence to create the dados a little bit deeper into the workpiece. If you can imagine this being a little bit taller, I can just use a table saw fence and then create more dados throughout the length of my side panels here. If you are buying a router table, consider that you're purchasing a new machine, so that's definitely a big chunk of money that you have to invest in. And also, if you're like me, you're in a smaller workspace. I'm in a 2-car garage, a very small 2-car garage. So having another tool might not be ideal for you, especially one that takes up a lot of floor space, which is the benefit of having an inline router table like the saw stop right here. I was able to remove the old melamine wing that it came with and then replace it with the router table. And that didn't take away any floor space at all. So definitely a benefit there if you go with the inline version. It's a plane going by right now. However, the last method that I'll show you is going over to the table saw. And this is my method, my preferred method to create dados, because to me it's much safer. I have more flexibility with the table saw. So my table saw has a capacity of 36 inches, so I can make dados up to 36 inches. With that 36 inches, I can flip the workpiece around and I can pretty much do a shelf up to 72 inches around there. There's plenty of capacity for me. And also if I'm working with very deep pieces, 24 inches deep, 36 inches deep, making cabinets, having this large work surface definitely makes me a little bit more comfortable when I'm making my cuts. So those are the reasons why I prefer to use the table saw to create my dados. However, keep in mind, depending on where you live in the world and also what table saw setup you have, you may not be able to use this method to create dados. So I'll look at the other 2 methods to see which one works best for you in your shop. Using just the dado joint and a rabbet joint, I'm going to create this cubby for the sandpaper that I don't typically use on a project. This is going to just sit in the back on my French cleat wall. But first, let's take a look at the dado stack that we're going to use on the table saw to make this joint. So this was sent to me by SawStop. This is their dado set here. If you're not familiar with dado stacks, it's pretty much different blades that you combine together to get the width of the dado that you need. Like most sets, you're going to get 2 outside blades. These are going to be one for the left side, one for the right side. And then you get different types of chipper blades, which are these things right here. So what you would do is, depending on the width of your dado, you would just take your chipper and you would stack them to get the right dado width that you're looking for. Now, if for some reason the dado is a little bit too tight, you can use these shims right here that they include, which will fine tune the width of your joint. So it's great that they include that as well. Then you want to consider, especially if you have a saw stop, is the cartridge. So you're gonna have to buy this as a separate item. You can't use the same cartridge that you use with your 10-inch table saw blade. You have to get a different one. And changing out the cartridge is not a big deal. It takes like 5 seconds. So it's not a big inconvenience at all, but just know that you have to buy this separately. The great thing about this set is that it comes with a chart that shows you the combination of thicknesses you can achieve. So all you have to do is look at the chart, take out the chippers that you need, and you're pretty much set. Setting up the dado stack can take some time, especially if you're trying to fine tune the fit. So there is that downside. However, this method is great if you're trying to make a lot of the same width dados on any given project. I think the speed, accuracy, and flexibility of working on larger projects far outweigh cons of setup time. Also, I've replaced so many router bits, more than I would like to admit, compared to dado stacks. I've had friends who have used dado stacks for over 10 years and it's working perfectly fine. So these blades, they can last a very long time. And one thing I wanted to point out is if you're going for a very wide dado like this is almost a 3/4 inch cut that I'm going for. What's gonna happen is if you stick on your arbor washer here, you're not gonna have a lot of room left on the arbor to tighten in your nut. As you can see here, it's probably like in 1/4 of an inch left. What I like to do is instead of using the arbor washer here, I like to use this thing here. This is a blade stabilizer. This one is 3 inches, made for 8-inch diameter blades. So this is gonna work perfectly fine for us. I'm going to use this instead of the arbor washer, and I just install it like how I would typically with the arbor washer, stick that in place. And now you can see there's a lot more of that thread exposed. With that in place, I can just tighten in the nut and we can go ahead and make our cuts. I love the packaging that comes with the SawStop dado stack. There's a place for practically everything, and I can easily stow it away when it's not in use. And the best part is it cuts really nice, like really nice. The bottom is very clean and I have no complaints there. For all of the technical people out there, there is a difference between dados and grooves. Dado cuts are made perpendicular to the grain while grooves are made parallel to the grain. But I'm not big on semantics, so call it a groove or call it a dado if you want. It's practically the same thing. Or are they? But we can all agree that a rabbit is a dado or a groove cut along the edge of your workpiece. And it's also a cute fluffy animal that Elmer Fudd isn't too fond of. As I mentioned before, a good tip is to rotate your piece 180 degrees if you want dados perfectly mirrored on either side. It'll save so much time trying to measure things out when you're working on a piece with equal dado spacings. What you'll see now is the importance of setting up the blade correctly. On the left dado, my outside blades were in the wrong location. They needed to be swapped and therefore left 2 thin lines at the bottom of the cut. On the right side shows a proper placement of the outside blades. The bottom is super clean and no lines are left from the cut. Once I'm done with the dado stack, everything just fits into place like how it was inside of the case. Then I'll just work backwards to install my 10-inch blade. When I'm making something like a small shelf, I like to use one piece of plywood that is wide enough for both the left and right panels. That way I can create the dados first and then cut the plywood into the correct width. This speeds up the process and perfectly mirrors the dados on both the left and right panels. Now that I have all the parts cut out, I'll assemble the storage box using glue and nails. As you can see, the fit using the dado based on the chart is perfect. So there you guys have it. Very simple project that I just put together in like less than an hour or so, using nothing but dado joints. And all I have to do now is just put a cleat in the back and I can mount it on my French cleat wall back here in the shop. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's 3 ways to make a dado using 3 different types of tool setup. Hopefully you have one of these setups in your garage. If you haven't tried out this joint yet, definitely give it a shot. If you did enjoy this video, if you want to see more of this type of video, leave a comment down below. Hit that like button, definitely subscribe. Until next time, guys, it's been Dado Design Craft Workshop. See you.